You know, I seriously didn't want to address this subject because doing so makes me angry. And while I'm sure that there's a ton of things that could be examined from the Obama presidency, the truth is he's too puny, too inconsequential a figure for me to give a play-by-play analysis to. Simply put, I just can't motivate myself to get that concerned over the tenure of a do-nothing empty suit of a president. All Barack Obama deserves, and I'm being too generous by half here, is for me to touch on a few salient points. Feel free to give your own ideas in the comments section. Now, was there anything good off the bat that Obama did in his presidency? Well, I'm talking about in general. Obviously, for black people, he did nothing at all. Well, I guess as far as the cosmetics go, from an image point of view, Barack Obama was not an embarrassment, not even to black people, as far as the way that he presented himself, stood in front of the teleprompter and talked to the press, or on the world stage for that matter. Barack Obama never made any verbal gaffes, at least none that will follow him. He had no awkward moments to speak of, and he was always poised and cool, even when being yelled at live on air by a racist Republican clown. Nope, seemed nothing ever got to him. Not even the calls for justice by black people, though we'll get to that later. Barack Obama is by far the most studious president in living memory. In manner and comportment, he was more presidential than anyone we've ever seen in the White House. So for future historians chronicling his tenure, they will have a hard time attempting to make him to seem as less than his white counterparts. As far as presidents go, however, Barack Obama will ultimately be remembered in the same company as a President Grant or a George H.W. Bush. He had a couple of big moments, but nothing that changed the world. He merely launched some military campaigns, as presidents always do, gave a couple of stirring speeches, and fortunately nothing like 9/11 happened on his watch. He'll be an average president, and for him, a man who lived his entire life trying not to offend too many white people, that will be more than sufficient. To Barack Obama, his legacy was that he didn't ruffle any feathers, certainly not white ones, and that's what he always wanted to be remembered for. Of course, we can't mention Obama's presidency without mentioning his signature achievement. No, not health care, besides that's going to get wiped out in the next year or so anyway. I'm talking about the successful killing of Osama bin Laden. For Barack Obama, that happened to be a win-win all around. Republicans had spent years saying that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim. Kinda hard to do that after he killed the most notorious radical Muslim on the planet. Barack Obama managed to do in 2 years what both Bill Clinton and W failed to do in over 15, to kill the leader of Al-Qaeda. After 9/11, W botched the siege of the Tora Bora Mountains, and once he'd parlayed a national tragedy into a blank check to pursue his interest in Iraq, Bush completely abandoned all efforts to kill the terrorist leader. I suppose from W's point of view, a living terrorist leader was of more political value than a dead one. After all, so long as bin Laden was still alive out there somewhere, Bush could always wave the bloody flag of 9/11 and tell everyone that they had better obey him lest another national tragedy befall the nation. Never mind the fact that it was Bush's gargantuan incompetence that allowed 9/11 to happen in the first place. How many presidential daily briefings had that nincompoop ignored? How many times had he been warned that Al-Qaeda was about to strike in the U.S. and he had other things to do after all? Those presidential briefings were always saying that Al-Qaeda was just about to strike. I guess it never occurred to the moron that the reason that the reports all said that was because they were about to strike. Well, Barack Obama took office, and as soon as he was sworn in, he very quietly restarted the investigation into Osama bin Laden's whereabouts. he quietly retasked the CIA with picking up the long-since cold trail of Osama bin Laden. And what a surprise! It turned out finding him was easier than anyone thought. In what amounts to his only real example of bold foresight, you'll recall that during his Democratic primary debates with then Senator Hillary Clinton, Obama repeatedly said that he would send U.S. forces into Pakistan without asking that government's permission if that's what it took to get Osama bin Laden. Senator Clinton scoffed at the idea. On live television, she told everyone that that was precisely the type of brash advocacy that was exactly the reason that Senator Obama lacked the judgment to be president. Of course, this is the same Senator Clinton who, when she became Secretary of State, all but started the Syrian civil war and threatened one country after the other. Anyway, the rest is history. The CIA successfully tracked bin Laden down in short order, and Obama got a chance to go to the war room of the White House and pose for an uncharacteristically engaged photo of himself leaning forward like he was watching an intense football game, when in fact he was merely watching the raid going down. Without the loss of a single American soldier, Osama bin Laden was killed. About the only loss during the mission was of one of their stealth helicopters. Gee, after Desert One, Somalia, and now this, maybe the U.S. needs to stick to ground transport when it comes to conducting special operations. Helicopters are clearly bad luck for the U.S. military special forces. After the killing of Osama bin Laden, Republicans tried in vain to rebrand the operation as somehow having something to do with George W. Bush, but that fell flat. The public wasn't fooled, and so Barack Obama does get the credit for having killed the leader of the September 11th attack. That brings us to the next subject, disaster relief. Unlike W, when massive floods hit South Louisiana last summer, Barack Obama actually managed to mobilize the National Guard and respond quickly. But then again, he was actually wanting to respond, so I'm not sure how much praise he should get for doing his job, because after all, there was another water crisis that took place in America that Barack Obama didn't respond to. I'm talking about the lead water crisis in Flint, Michigan. He decided to pull a W on that one, not giving any substantive response at all to people whose problem was not too much water, but rather too little. And so we see the balancing of this whole policy. He had a natural disaster in Louisiana that he responded to because it was advantageous to him, and a man-made disaster in Flint, Michigan that he didn't respond to because politically it wasn't advantageous. He knew full well that if he was going to respond to the crisis in Flint, that he would also have to challenge the Republicans' pathetic state emergency manager ploy that everybody knew was rooted totally in racism. He would have the Justice Department actually have to investigate and at some point sue the Republican governor and even possibly pursue criminal charges against Rick Snyder. But for the milquetoast President Barack Obama, that was a little bit too much steel that he would have to have in his spine to pull that one off. And so, with black people desperately asking for help, Barack Obama decided he just couldn't. Now, here's one that a lot of you probably don't think too much about, but it was actually something that was near and dear to my heart. The FCC. Barack Obama surprised me when he put Tom Wheeler in charge of it. That was because Tom Wheeler had actually come, like many of the other FCC commissioners before him, from the very communications corporations themselves. But Tom Wheeler, it turned out, couldn't be so easily controlled by the communications cartels. And Chairman Wheeler has actually done much to try to restore something resembling public control to the public commons. And the truth is, Barack Obama was the one who put FCC Chairman Wheeler in place. He defended net neutrality, among other communications policies, and that was a big win. And I got news for you folks, the internet was not created by the communications cartels. Like all of America's infrastructure, it was created by your and my tax dollars. The big corporations came in and just took advantage of what the American taxpayer had already put in place. They then did what they always do. They went to the government and demanded laws that would make it where all of these publicly funded institutions would be off limits to the very public who created them in the first place, monopolizing the public commons, locking the people out of the very arenas that their tax dollars created. They did it with telegraphs in the 19th century and later telephones, motion pictures, then airlines, radio, television, and now the internet. The big problems with the prior forms of media was that the cost to produce them was prohibitively expensive. This acted as a natural barrier that kept all except for the elites out, and as I keep telling you, the men who own the media do not and have never seen themselves as being in the business of entertainment. They understand that they are in the business of mind control. The media defines the culture, and those who own the media see themselves as cultural gatekeepers. They do social engineering through the media. They arbitrarily decide who will be heard and who won't. They also decide how people are to be portrayed in their media. Who is to be seen as the good guys, who are to be seen as the bad ones, and for what reasons. They dictate to the public what to think and, more importantly, what to think about what they've seen. And their control is absolute and impossible to challenge, or at least it was, until the advent of new media. The guys who previously controlled all venues of communications want their monopoly back. Too many people, particularly new black media, are talking, and worse than that, they're saying the wrong things. They are telling people to stop going along with the status quo. People realize they're not alone anymore, and worst of all, these people are meeting online but organizing offline. The white media used to be able to tell people that black empowerment was only for kooks, that America is just fine, and the bad stuff that happens every day because of white supremacy, well, these are only some minor flaws, but other than that, everything's cool. They could talk around the issues, but with new black media voices that have emerged that are coming straight up the middle, this isn't so easy anymore. We are challenging the status quo by taking control of the discourse within the black community and elevating the debate. Because for too long, the dominant society has attempted to dictate to black people a false choice, that we could either support white leftists or be pretend establishment types and become token Negroes for the right. But we in intelligent black society started a new conversation by alerting our people to the fact that there has always been a third option: black empowerment. And we've been heard. The white media has been forced to cut back on the number of bought and paid for black pundits that they put on air and choose some who sound somewhat more like us. Sure, these clowns are selling the same soap, albeit in a different package. But the point is, we're fighting the bastards. And in order for the white media to compete, we haven't had to start talking more like them. They've had to start talking more like us. They know we're here. They've heard our message, and they fear it. They should. In response to the threat that new black media now poses, the white media has tried to preempt us by establishing what they've branded as black-oriented websites. But we educated our people about that scam. We've taught black people to finally start asking exactly who owns these websites, TV stations, and publications that you see black columnists working for. We have established a new vocabulary geared towards anathematizing those who the white media has traditionally used to deceive and mislead us, and to expose these new charlatans who, as usual, pretend to speak to our interest, but who ultimately are there to try to dictate to us to blow off some steam and go home. The Al Sharptons, the Jonathan Capeharts, the D. Ray McKeesons, the Jamila Lemieux, and the Goldie Taylors, the Melissa Harris Lacewell Perrys and their dim-witted wannabes. Thanks to us, cooning is a career that doesn't come with a retirement plan. And in Goldie Taylor's case, it doesn't even come with a plan B. And before it's all over, cooning won't be a viable career choice at all. This is what we are able to do with the meager resources that we have today in our infancy when everything is just started. Imagine what can happen with a concerted effort across the board, organized and properly funded. That's what the future of new black media is, and that is what the white gatekeepers are hoping to kill early. We've gathered our following and have educated them about exactly who it is who pays the black pundits and writers you see and hear to say the crap that they do. We have isolated them and are now beginning a substantive effort to push back hard. The white media cannot afford to give a platform to us, not even for the sake of debunking us, because our message is airtight. To even mention us would be the same as attacking themselves. So their strategy now is to try to use the government that they own to prohibit us from being able to use new media at all. They want to turn it into the same closed shop that TV and the movies are. Sure, it's there, but without government permission, you'll never be able to use it. So, to have the FCC that Obama put in place fight the bad guys is an undeniable good. I guess that's how Obama manages to live with himself. He went back on so much of his own rhetoric and promises, and time and again refused to do the moral thing, even when it would have been so easy. And I wouldn't sniff at that if I were you. With Donald Trump coming into office and the looming AT&T-Warner Brothers merger, I think we're about to see a massive rollback of these hard-fought, hard-won freedoms. And before long, you may well be looking back at Barack Obama's FCC and saying, those were the good old days. Well, we better be prepared to fight these regressive white media forces that are about to be on the march, because the main weapon that new black media has been able to wield is the fact that we can now reach a large number of people. We've been able to get around the gatekeepers and go directly to the masses. When you reach the masses with lies, you can enslave them. But when you reach them with the truth, you set entire nations free. Okay, here's one that will get honorable mention. Barack Obama staved off another Great Depression, right? Well, for most black people, this is a distinction without a difference. The same way we hadn't been greatly affected by the real Great Depression back in the 30s, so we haven't seen any great deal of improvement between our condition now and during 2008. As Dick Gregory said, they took my house back when times were good. Our problem as black people isn't the condition of the housing market, or Wall Street derivatives, or any of the other things that white people are concerned with in their efforts to get their money to make money for them. Our problem is, and always has been, that we need an economy of our own. Barack Obama didn't have to do it for us, but he also didn't have to ignore us either and throw roadblocks in our path. Though we should be bluntly honest and admit that a great deal of Barack Obama's complete refusal to produce for black people was that too many of us were only too willing to keep giving him an out, asking nothing of him and requiring less. Excuse after excuse for fully 8 years, in fact, closer to 10 when you consider the 2 years that he spent gearing up for his presidential run. Black people were always saying, well, he can't do anything for black people until he becomes president, so don't demand that he make any commitments on the campaign trail. Once he got into office, well, we want to give him some time to settle in. We don't want to be dumping all of our demands on him, even though everybody else was dumping all of their demands on him. When he did nothing during his first term, we had 4 years of empty-headed clods saying, well, you gotta give him more time. And that became the mantra for 8 years. Give him until his second term. When he got to his second term, he still did nothing. He was handing out executive orders like they were so many pieces of candy on Halloween, but there were no treats for black people. He had executive orders for illegal aliens, for gays, for everyone except black people. Now, what does that tell you? Barack Obama knew full well that he had no plans of ever doing anything for black people. And the fact that so many black people foolishly decided to keep making excuses for him showed him that he would not have to pay a political price for it. Another of the feathers in Barack Obama's cap was that he saved General Motors, who then turned right around and continued to send jobs overseas. U.S. taxpayers were forced to bail General Motors out when the American public owes General Motors nothing. GM was a main culprit in the hollowing out of the American middle class. It is a crime that they got anything after what they've done. At the very least, they should have been made to pledge to bring back the jobs that they sent overseas as the price of getting money from the very American people who they have been dumping out on the streets and leaving for dead for fully 3 decades now. How many news pieces have you seen of people walking out of yet another closed GM plant, looking like a defeated army resigned to quit the battlefield, or rather like a betrayed army whose commanders ran away in the middle of the fight? Meanwhile, General Motors has been making record profits, and that's what makes General Motors' betrayal so galling. It would be one thing if General Motors had skipped town because the company was in trouble and had no choice but to seek cheaper labor offshore, but they began this policy of sending their operations overseas precisely at the time that the company was making more money than God. Folks, this wasn't about profit at all. This was only about class warfare. Yes, I know, class has nothing to do with black people, but it wasn't race that prompted General Motors to rip the American public off. It was the white elites attempting to turn the U.S. into the third world, impoverished, desperate, and easy to control. Sure, Barack Obama dumped Rick Wagner, but the truth is, after all of his screw-ups, Wagner was on his way out the door no matter what, and the taxpayers were forced to subsidize his golden parachute. And as black people, we have a particular bone to pick with General Motors. They were the ones who decided to gang rape Detroit and Flint and dump both of their bodies in the bay. The only black people of any note, in numbers other than a handful who managed to make it into the middle class, were precisely because of General Motors. And these black people were very loyal to General Motors as customers. And that same General Motors turned around and slapped these black cities in the face, taking their profits overseas, and then the same black people who had barely survived the exfiltration of General Motors then were forced to take what little money they had from what little jobs were left and then give them to General Motors all over again. This was a double insult. But the capstone on Barack Obama's bailout foolishness was without doubt his no-strings-attached bailout of Wall Street. Yeah, W set everything in motion, he set all that crap up, but Barack Obama was the one who allowed it to be completed. Billions and billions of dollars, without so much as a single condition attached to any of its use. Gee, I wonder if those same banks would be willing to give us, say, $1 million with no terms whatsoever. Just give me the money to spend however I want and with no obligation to ever pay it back. Barack Obama's #1 goal was to pay back his corporate masters through policy, and he did. It was the American homeowners who needed a bailout, not the banks. But Barack Obama wasn't there to carry out the wishes of the public. He was there to carry out the whims of the elite. Obama got more money in campaign donations than any presidential candidate in American history, Democrat or Republican. I'd like you to take a moment and think about that. Candidate Obama got more than Hillary Clinton, more than George W. Bush got. Now, do you really think that was all because he was such a charismatic personality and just bowled these fat cats over? Money is every bit as important in a presidential election as running the right candidate. They didn't give him the money because they liked him. They gave him the money because they saw a unique advantage in backing Obama for the presidency. Neither the Democrats nor Barack Obama has ever established themselves as being so tight with big business that big business would need to part with $500 million for them. Hell, Hillary was closer to Goldman Sachs than Obama could ever hope to be, yet they didn't give her the kind of money they gave him. Perhaps because they could tell in 2008 that they had a far better prospect in Senator Obama. Now, think about all the money that W gave to big business. He raped the national treasury for them, allowed them to crush other countries merely to plunder them, removed practically all meaningful regulation of Wall Street and heavy industries. Yet he didn't get near what Barack Obama got in campaign donations. W will be remembered as the biggest political whore in American history. He will be remembered as the clown who gave away the store to every corporate creep who came in the door. He allowed them to live tax-free at the public's expense. No politician of any country would dare to skin his own people alive the way W did for big business. No one has been a greater stooge for them than him, and yet Obama got more in donations than W, and this before he got into office. For a man with no connections and no power, they opened their wallets wide for him. Now, what on earth could Barack Obama possibly have offered these men that was more valuable than what W had already done? Well, when you look at the fact that not one of these corporate crooks has gone to prison, almost none of them has been so much as indicted or investigated. They got billions of dollars from the public for free, dollars that they then used to continue their freewheeling, bonus-filled days, and that there were no substantive laws passed to restrict their behavior in the aftermath of the greatest financial catastrophe since the Great Depression. Well, when you think about that, I believe we're finally beginning to understand what it was that Barack Obama promised them. This country was on the verge of a revolution 8 years ago, and that's no overstatement. So by using the monumental distraction of nominating a half-black candidate, the country could be pretending to confront its original sin, when in truth, Obama was just a flimsy front man trotted out by big business to protect their interests. He defused a revolution, but in short order the old life returned, and things went on as they always had. In other countries, you defuse a revolution by sending in the military and gunning everyone down, but in the U.S., things are done a little differently. You just invest $500 million in a skillful political puppet who will go out there and dispel all that public fury. And the best part is, you're going to get all of that $500 million back many times over from the exact same public who you just pulled the wool over the eyes of. You know, in Japan, when a corporate leader fails, he has to go before the cameras and show his remorse. You're forced to have to humiliate yourself before the people because they put their fate in your hands and you failed. No such culture exists in the United States, because the U.S. is under white supremacy, and these bastards have no shame. Barack Obama had a golden opportunity in his first 2 years to get his agenda through, but he lacked the boldness and the foresight to capitalize on this opportunity. His first 2 years in office, Democrats controlled Congress. Instead of going for the gusto like he should have, he instead went for meaningless photo-op legislation like the Liddy Ledbetter Act, which was just a bare sop to feminists who were not the reason that he was in office, rather the black community was. But hey, Obama needed to mend his fences with the angry white females who were still sore that a black man was in the Oval Office instead of one of them. When Barack Obama got into the presidency, he was so busy being afraid that Republicans would say, "See, he's a divider, not a uniter." He was terrified to actually take on the Republicans because all he could think about was white people being displeased with him even in the slightest. But of course, as we all know, his bowing and scraping before the bigots on Capitol Hill didn't get him anything. He portrayed himself as being weak. They lost any and all consideration for him and instead ratcheted up the attacks. But in addition to being politically misguided, he was also fooling himself about the idea that he could ever bring Washington together. Barack Obama was criminally naive due to his own racial schizophrenia. A half-black man raised by a racist grandmother, Barry Obama has always had an issue with his blackness, lacking though it may be. He sees the world through white people's eyes, believes himself to be one of them merely because his mother just so happened to be a Caucasian. But he failed to ever realize that white people already have a definition for their ethnicity, and so much as one drop of black blood means you can never qualify. You know, fat people will often hang around skinny people, walking right in between them because it makes them feel skinny themselves. Obama suffers from the same delusion. He hangs around white people because it helps him think of himself as more white. And so no matter how many wake-up calls white supremacy gave him, he never seemed to get the message. You know, here's an interesting factoid for you. Barack Obama went to Harvard. Then again, so did right-wing white supremacist Ben Shapiro, or as I prefer to call him, BS. So, BO and BS went to the same university. Makes sense when you think about it. Now we understand what purpose the Ivy League serves. Kids go in merely ignorant and come out totally stupid. It takes a lack of schooling to make someone uninformed, but only an Ivy League education can turn someone into a mouth-breathing idiot. Speaking of idiots, Barack Obama had not one but two do-nothing attorney generals, Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch, who both refused to do anything about the free-roaming white supremacists fighting an open race war against black citizens. Instead, Obama chose to go before black audiences, always with cameras in tow, and lecture black men, and only black men, about how they need to stay home and be fathers, repeating the same kind of brain-dead talking points that white people always use. Seemed Barry never thought it was the wrong time to take some cheap shots at black men. This was his sop to white voters. He knew nothing tickled white people more than to see Obama reinforce white stereotypes. He knew nothing that he ever said would anger white people too long, so long as he made sure to bring in the black community for some abuse. That was always his get-out-of-jail-free card with the white electorate. The Obama Justice Department's pretend takeover of the Cleveland PD and Ferguson Police Departments and the so-called investigation of the Chicago PD were all just feeble PR maneuvers. These police departments and dozens more are dirty as hell. They should have had half of their respective police officers in handcuffs. But never happened. It wasn't supposed to. It was just some more political theater being put on for black people's benefit. This was Obama's way of helping to rehabilitate one of the primary institutions of white supremacy. At some point, after the damage that the police had taken in the eyes of the public thanks to Black Lives Matters, and more importantly, thanks to the continued efforts of new black media, Barack Obama found himself having to help patch up the image of the enforcement arm of white supremacy. After all, without legitimacy, the police have no power, and we were directly attacking their legitimacy. Now the police are able to claim that they had rooted out the racists in their midst and put in place new policies, when in truth, they've done nothing at all. All of these departments that Loretta Lynch claimed to have taken over could now go before the public and brag that Barack Obama's Justice Department gave them a clean bill of health and that now they are beyond criticism. Think of it as going to a car wash. They were able to rinse off some of the dirt, but that's okay. They're going to go mud riding again in about 5 minutes, and nothing changes. Obama's Justice Department should have been running roughshod over the white supremacists, not just in the police, but in the society as a whole. They should have been declaring white supremacists terrorists, which is what they are. After the Charleston massacre, there was absolutely no excuse for not having done so. But Obama understood that most white people in the U.S. are outright white supremacists, or at the very least, highly sympathetic to the white supremacist cause. That's because every white person in America directly depends on white supremacy for every crumb of their daily bread. Obama knows, like everyone else, that if he ever actually were to tackle white supremacy, then it would require doing more than going after a few gun-toting bigots. There is an entire apparatus of white supremacy in government, business, and society. Whole scores of white people at every level who are fighting a race war against black people, and have been for a damned long time. The FBI wrote a report 10 years ago sounding the alarm to the fact that white supremacists had infiltrated law enforcement in America nationwide. And when you look at FBI Director James Comey, you see the white supremacists had successfully captured the post of America's top cop. Obama's deathly fear of offending white people has always been his Achilles heel. He knows the lies and duplicity white people engage in order to rationalize their behavior. He knows why they do it. Most white people are white supremacists. Perhaps not violent extremists, but certainly supporters of the violent extremists. You can fight white supremacy and defeat it using the power of the state. This was certainly the case in the 19th century after the end of slavery. Problem is, the effort has to be ongoing. Obama never had the nerve to confront white people, even when they gave him permission to do so. But without doubt, the greatest failure of Barack Hussein Obama's presidency was his total disdain and hostility toward the black community, even himself. He sought to secure his, and I'm sure he hopes one day his daughter's position at the cost of ours, always bashing black people, but particularly black men. He understood full well that by doing this, he was essentially apologizing for being black. And that's definitely the message that the white electorate picked up from his constant attacking of black men. Black children fight white supremacy in the streets, and he calls them thugs. Meanwhile, white college kids tear up their own communities over a pumpkin festival, and they're not thugs. Black kids fight police in the streets, and he calls them lawless, while the white supremacist DAs who routinely throw cases are not. Every white supremacist attack always turned into an opportunity to upbraid black people for something. After Sandy Hook, he cried like a bitch. After the Charleston massacre, however, he broke out into a song. And that action sent a clear message to the white supremacists, emboldening them further. He never called white supremacy terrorism, never signed or even proposed so much as one piece of legislation to protect black people or to punish white race terrorists, never pushed one policy geared toward making it a priority to prosecute police for murder. Gay marriage prompted him to light up the White House, as if some kind of victory had been won. Yet, after the Charleston massacre, Obama's White House didn't even have the decency to lower the flag at half-staff. He certainly lowered the flag after Sandy Hook, but then again, those were white children, so he felt compelled to. And that is what Obama will be most remembered for by intelligent black society. Not merely his moral cowardice, but his lack of morality whatsoever. The fact that no matter how cool and calm he tried to present himself in public, he lived in mortal fear of displeasing white people even in the slightest. Even when they didn't have the ability to hurt him, he still feared them deathly. All it took was just the slightest criticism from a white person, and they were always threatening to criticize him, and he would tuck tail and run, and they knew it. He destroyed Shirley Sherrod's career merely because the racist hate peddler Andrew Breitbart, may he rot in hell, posted a clearly doctored video edited so as to prop up the asinine assertion that Shirley Sherrod hated white people. How could that be the case? She worked for white people, on white people's behalf at the Agriculture Department. Never mind the fact that the event that she talked at, she mentioned that it was in the 1980s, well before Obama got into office. Never mind that she herself said at that event that all she cared about was to make sure that she was fair to everyone. Obama's absolute terror of white people caused him to demand that this innocent woman text in her resignation while she was driving home. She had to pull over on the side of the road and text in a quickie resignation because the White House simply couldn't wait to announce that they had fired her. He was so eager to try to beat the white supremacist right-wing media cycle, and in the end all he wound up doing was being a dog chasing its own tail. He thought that he could actually appease them by handing them Shirley Sherrod's head. But he appeased nothing. Had he merely shown some spine in front of these white supremacists, they would have backed down. But he sees the world through the eyes of white people. So he knows only too well that in reality, no matter how much white people may claim they don't mind a black person speaking their mind, in truth, they hate and fear it. If a black man raises his voice, it's a threat. If a black man doesn't use only pleasant words in white people's presence, they get upset. Doesn't matter if it's white conservatives or white liberals. They both have the same attitude where black people are concerned. That black people owe it to white people to bend over backwards and twist ourselves into knots just to make sure we don't do or say anything that isn't pretty as they please. You have to be in a straitjacket as a black person when you deal with white folks. And the problem is, they hold the reins of power in this country. They're still the numerical majority. So they have the numbers and the policy heft to throw tons of roadblocks in our path. And they do. White people whine like babies that if they're criticized, that somehow is the same thing, but they then go and do whatever white supremacist crap they want because they fully realize that black criticism can't actually go beyond that towards action. America has not changed because white people haven't changed. You will never end white supremacy until you first end white power. Obama has never devoted himself to that. The white powers who put him in office knew that from the jump. That's why they put him there. White people say that they want their country back. Black people are the ones who built it. If anything, we want our country back. But the allegedly first black president never bothered to even acknowledge who built the White House that he lived in, or the Capitol building that his enemies conspired his downfall from. Change you could believe in was of course no change at all. He showed moral cowardice at a time when moral courage was called for, guaranteeing that the end of his presidency would be as dishonest as its beginning. For now he's leaving the white portion of the country far better than he found them, and black people far worse. Barack Obama has always been a mountain climber, looking for new challenges to conquer, and his ticket to ride has been that he's always been willing to reassure white people that although he's a smart Negro, he's also a good Negro too. It's what drove him to go to Harvard and made him the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review. It's also what drove him to try to defeat Bobby Rush in his ill-fated congressional bid, Obama realized even then with that early defeat that his black cred was sorely lacking. And I believe that that early rejection from the black community is where not a little of his disdain for black America originated. He's always been something of a three-dimensional chess player, always trying to play the game from multiple angles, and that's fine, except that his objective was only to keep his own head above water with white people. He played a very clever game, but always for low stakes. At this point, I'm sure he thinks himself quite clever. He hopes that one of his daughters will follow him into the White House one day, and that his attacks on the black community and his reputation for eagerly bowing before white people will help grease the skids for her. But it won't happen. The powers that be got their usefulness out of him. He served his purpose. He stopped a forming revolution and maintained the status quo, all at black people's expense. And now they're done with him. He's finished, but he trusts white people, so he's the last one to realize it. He's still daydreaming about being at Sasha or Malia's inauguration one day. Well, as Benjamin Franklin once said, those who would trade liberty for security in the end will have neither. This epitomizes what happened to B.O. He played it safe to ingratiate himself with white people, all for the sake of guaranteeing his own position and laying the groundwork for what he hopes to be a family dynasty. But the white folks who put him in office never wanted him there, so just as they handed him his place in history, they will also take it from him. And that brings me to the one good thing for black people that came out of Obama's presidency, though it was something that he had nothing to do with. Black people became so disillusioned with being continually disappointed and lied to by him that at least this once in 2016, we finally decided to attach concrete demands to our vote for president. Granted, the demands weren't very specific, but at least for the first time in a damned long time they were actually there. And the first demand was the most important. What are these good white liberals going to do for black people? Not people of color, not minorities, not the inner city. We were demanding real commitments for black people. We stopped trying to be colorblind because all we had succeeded in doing was proving that we would put others before ourselves, and that day is done. When Mark O'Malley tried to say all lives matters, that was the end of his presidential bid and most likely his political career. When Bernie Sanders refused to support reparations, he began to hemorrhage black support, and his campaign never recovered. And as for Hillary Clinton, she had a few black females during her primary run, but by the time the general election rolled around, she'd thrown even those pitiful dead-ender support away. And people were only too eager to remind her of the fact that she had played a key role in constructing the American Gulag with the '96 Omnibus Crime Bill. And when her husband refused to apologize for it, and refused to acknowledge the wrong that he had done, and the fact that they had both spent the 20 years after his presidency not doing a damn thing about the Gulag that they had put in place, that was the end of black America's love affair with the Clintons. Ever so slightly, after these last 8 painful years, our eyes are beginning to open, ever so much. That was the big political takeaway for black people after the first half-black president's tenure in office. The color of the president means nothing unless he makes commitments to you, and the commitment must take the form of him meeting you face to face and agreeing to the agenda that you tell him that he must pursue. No more allowing people to get away with ambiguous slogans that are so vague as to be meaningless. Politicians are very good for that. We here in intelligent black society taught you how during her debates with Donald Trump, Hillary would say things like stop and frisk was not effective, and how that was no refutation of the policy. A commitment is simple, plain, and to the point. It's not some circuitous jargon where the person is trying to talk his way around the issue. What Obama did was not benign neglect, it was malignant neglect. We can only hope that the lesson sticks with black people this time.